Welcome. Thank you for coming to join us today for this very special presentation. My name is George Rogovsky. I'm a professor of astronomy and data science at Caltech and director of the Center for Data-Driven Discovery. And as I like to call myself, a mostly benevolent dictator of Birtech. So today we're very happy to have Mei Lin Fung. She is the chair of a nonprofit called People-Centered Internet, which she co-founded with Vint Cerf, one of the founders of the Internet itself. She is the chair of the IEEE, Society and Technology Technical Committee on Sustainability. She is also emeritus chair of California Health Medical Reserve Corps and a member of the United Nations Science Steering Committee. She will introduce herself as well as her organization in a moment. What we're doing today is showing some of the interviews that she conducted with three of the major founders of the Internet. Each of those will be about 10 to 12 minutes long. She will introduce each one of those. And after all that, we will have question and answer. Tomorrow, we have a second part of this little celebration, which is showing one video from Greek Prime Minister, very interesting, and have a more of an open discussion. So, Internet, as you sure would agree, is probably one of the most transformative technologies ever. And this year we celebrate its 50th anniversary, which is a little fuzzy date-wise. The conception of the Internet is due to this gentleman on the Wikipedia page shown on the screen, J.C.R. Licklider. He was a cognitive and computer scientist and one of the program directors of ARPA. So they conceived this network as a means of providing robust communication network in case of nuclear attack. But then, of course, it took on its own. And so even though the idea was first proposed in early 1960s, it took about a decade to really get things going. And we choose 1974 as the birth date of the Internet when first major paper was published announcing its protocols and everything else. Okay, so without much further ado, yield to Mei Lin, who will introduce herself, organization, the event in the Royal Society in London on which videos were recorded, and then introduce Vint Cerf, one of the founders of the Internet. And save your questions for the end, please, so that there is no confusion. Questions should be asked in text. We will answer them in voice. So Mei Lin, up to you.
Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's my first visit to Second Life in about 15 years. I was here for 2008 when we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the mother of all demos, also in Second Life. And that was really a highlight for me to be working with Douglas Engelbart. So one of the curious features of my background is that I'm one of the few people who spent several years working with both Douglas Engelbart and Vint Cerf, who I've co-founded my current organization. Doug Engelbart, as most of you know, was at SRI, and these were the two nodes of the Internet, UCLA and SRI, that did the first transmission in 1969. But in 1974, the TCP/IP protocol was published by the IEEE Journal of Communications. And that's when Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf liked to record that was the date of the beginning of the Internet. This year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Internet in California, in Palo Alto, May 19th and 20th. The IEEE joined with the People-Centered Internet to produce this, and the segments are all publicly available at IEEE television, IEEE.tv. What we're going to see is what happened at the Royal Society in London in the UK. it was a huge privilege for us to celebrate the 50th anniversary at the Royal Society, which is the birthplace of modern science. This was organized by both the Royal Society and Dame Wendy Hall, who co-founded the Web Science Trust with Tim Berners-Lee. So, in fact, Tim Berners-Lee was there in the audience for the conversation we're about to hear. This conversation was between myself and Vint Cerf, and I tried to bring out some of the aspects that he doesn't always talk about. So I hope you'll enjoy it. George, I think we can start. From your perspective, what would you like to leave us with if we actually think that that's true and we want to go forward to build an internet that's worthy of being the foundation of all infrastructure?
Well, I think I tried to imply in my talk that in addition to building the physical infrastructure and the logical infrastructure, the software and the protocols, the things that Bob Kahn and I and others and Sir Tim have done, we need to now understand more deeply how they are being used and what kinds of information and what kinds of standards are needed in order to make these things usable in a safe and secure way. That may imply not only new protocols, but also content that we need in order to understand the origins of information. Provenance has turned out to be an important term in a lot of these discussions. Where did this information come from? Where did this object come from? In the art industry and in antiquities, there's always an important element of provenance. Who owned it? Where did it come from? What transactions have taken place? How can we establish a track record of those transactions? And so I think provenance is going to turn out to be a very important element. The other thing that's going to be important is figuring out how to introduce norms into our online society that provide incentive for better behavior, and to also that has both positive and negative components to it. Accountability and liability may turn out to be our friends as we try to fashion an online environment that we all want to be part of. So I think in addition to the fundamental physical infrastructure and the logical infrastructure, we need to have I guess I'll call it a regulatory infrastructure that produces better behavior than we have seen up until now.
Thank you. One of my biggest memories is you speaking at South by Southwest, where you spent almost the entire talk talking about Sigrid, his wife. And it really made me realize how much the access of the internet for people who are differently abled has actually come out of your own personal experience. I think that the internet is offering opportunities for more and more people of all different abilities. The panel that I will be chairing later is about the internet as a facilitator of opportunities. But I would like all of us to hear from Vint how his own personal experience actually made him realize that the internet needed to be for differently abled, the deaf, the blind.
Well, first of all, this isn't just about the internet. This is about software in general. And anyone who has any difficulty at all, either reading or hearing or with motor impairment, will know that a lot of the technologies and applications that we use are not very well adapted to people who need assistive technology. And this is partly a consequence of the fact that the people that make the software don't have intuition about how to make it accessible. You know, putting a blindfold on does not give you intuition about what works for someone who is blind. Sticking wax in your ear does not give you an intuition about how to make something accessible for a person with hearing impairment. You really need to understand what does and doesn't work. And I need more training, I think, to gain intuition. Let me just give you one worked example of this. Suppose that you're colorblind and people keep showing you charts that use different colors to distinguish information in the chart, and you can't tell the difference between some of the colors. So you're not getting the information you should be getting, or worse, you're getting conflated information because it's confusing. Now, if you also remember that shape is another way of conveying difference, or maybe texture is another way of conveying difference. If you said that, well, the red things are always circles and the blue things are always triangles and the green things are always hexagons, then if you turn off the color, it should still be understandable to someone who can't see the color. And that's a small little example. But it's the sort of thing you want people who are designing software to appreciate over a much broader range of possible interventions to improve accessibility. This makes me think of Alexander Graham Bell. His wife was deaf, just like my wife, Sigrid. And he invents the telephone, which deaf people can't use. And there's something twistedly ironic about that. So I think we need to work much harder on making things accessible, and that's not just about the internet, it's about software in general. But if you've given me an opportunity to tell a little story about Sigrid, because it's such a great story of how technology can make a huge difference. In Sigrid's case, she lost her hearing when she was 3 years old, which means she had acquired sound, but she had spinal meningitis and had a high temperature, and the little ciliary hairs inside the cochlea that normally move as the tympanum is oscillating from sound input were burned out, basically. They died, and so she didn't have any means of actually detecting the sound, which meant that the brain never got any signals saying there was sound coming in. But starting in 1973 or so, about the same time that the Ethernet was invented and the internet was being worked on, there was work going on in Australia and in the US on cochlear implants, which basically insert electrodes into the little snail-shaped cochlea, and then that's attached to a processing element which is going to stimulate various of the electrodes that are embedded in the auditory nerve. So what's going to happen is that this system is going to stimulate the auditory nerve and deliver signals to the brain, which the brain is supposed to interpret as sound. Now, in order for that to work, we have to understand pretty clearly how the brain interprets those signals. Yes. And we have to be able to generate those signals in a way that makes sense to the brain. So Sigrid, after having spent her 50 years lip reading only for communication, gets a cochlear implant in 1996. It's a 45-minute outpatient operation at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. She comes home, waits a couple of weeks, then she goes back to be activated, which basically means the speech processor is essentially programmed to take sound in, figure out which frequencies are present and at what amplitude, and then select electrodes to stimulate to deliver to the brain the information that this is the sound that the speech processor is detecting. So she gets all mapped up, and she picks up the phone. And we've been married for 30 years at this point. She picks up the phone and calls me, and we have a conversation for the first time on the telephone. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was pretty amazing. By the time I got home, I discovered I had a 53-year-old teenager at home. I couldn't get her off the phone. So she would calls would come from marketing people, and she would take up the phone, anybody. Now, at the time, I was senior VP at MCI for engineering, and this was AT&T calling. So Sigrid picks up the phone, and she says, hello, who are you? Well, we're calling for AT&T. Well, where are you? Well, I'm in India. And he said, wow, your English is pretty good. Where did you learn that? And so this goes on for about half an hour, and this poor soul saying, so you're going to switch now? And she says, no, my husband works for MCI, but thanks for calling. And she hangs up. And then she decided she wanted to listen to recorded books for the blind to hear words that she hadn't heard, how they were pronounced. So she calls the library. Remember, she's on the phone doing this. She asks, can I sign up for recorded books for the blind? And they say, sure, no problem. Name, address, phone number. And then they say, no, you're blind, aren't you? And she says, no, I'm deaf. And there's this long pause, and they're trying to figure out, how's that going to work? She ended up listening to 500 books on tape, and now she knows when people are mispronouncing words, and she recognizes accents. Then she went after any additional technology that would give her access to sound. So patch cords to plug into the airplane to watch the movie. All she's getting is the sound from the movie and not the screaming kid that's 2 seats away. She has a microphone that she carries with her at all times that you can clip on a lapel. She has an FM transmitter receiver that she could use in situations like this. So she is the bionic woman. But it's a great example of how you can push technology to make a big difference in your life. And I'm hoping that we can see similar kinds of developments for other kinds of disabilities that the internet and software in general can make real. And so I hope that some of our agenda over the next decades will be to achieve that objective.
Okay, so Mei Lin will now introduce the next interviewee, which is Alan Kay, another one of the founders of the internet.
Thank you, George. Vint is a very special person, and so is Alan Kay. It was my privilege to actually recruit Alan Kay for this this talk that he's giving, and I discovered, because I hadn't been in touch with him before, that he's been in London for the last 10 plus years, and he has cancer. So it is really important, I think, for us to try to catch what he's trying to tell us. He has insights that came off a very multidisciplinary background. And he's brought all of that together, but probably the wrapper around it is anthropology and psychology that has allowed him to be, basically, from my point of view, the father of personal computing. He envisaged the Dyna book at Xerox PARC, and so much of the work at PARC has his fingerprints, including object-oriented programming. And so it's my honor for you to listen to this speech, and he will be giving a 45-minute speech at the UN Science Summit on September 18th, and I was just speaking this morning for over an hour with him as he prepares for that speech. He is very, very dedicated to transferring as much as he can before he has to leave us. So, Alan, I would like to ask you, as one of the pioneers in computer science, a man so famous that every computer science knows your name, and a visionary in computing, how have you seen the internet transform opportunities and in education and innovation since its inception?
Thanks very much. I was going to see if I could get Vint to take off his tie, but that will be impossible. He's never been seen without one. So my answer, quick answer, well, of course the internet combined, these are 7 minutes, by the way, guaranteed. Of course the internet's combined technologies have made advances. So I'm not that interested in that so much because how could they not once it got going? But I'd like to ask 3 core questions on behalf of most of the people in the world. One is, have the most important opportunities been seized? And we're talking about looking back over about 45, well, let's say 50. I would say no. Have the transformations been beneficial enough for education and innovation? I would say no, not nearly beneficial enough. And especially if you compare notes with what I consider Vint and I are actually the sons of the pioneers. We operated in the late 60s, and the real pioneers were people like Engelbart and Licklider, who called for an intergalactic network. And they asked him, why did you do that? And he said, well, engineers always give you the minimum, so I want a worldwide network, so I'm asking for an intergalactic one. And the big question that has to be asked is, have critically important properties of internet and personal computing been missed? And I think this is the one not to be lost here, because everyone should be aware that almost everything they do every day, even if they're a professional in computer science, is actually a convenient simulation of old media. And that was to the joy of marketing people when they found out that that's all they had to sell in order to sell both personal computing and the internet. And that is not even close to being the story, and we can't get to it today. So I will just say the actual complexities of the local world, the world expanding out, and the entire planet are far beyond the ability of making marks on paper to represent adequately and to think about. The computer is the ideal technology to be able to handle dynamic systems in a dynamic way. So let me leave you with that thought. So the big deal here is, just to take an example, the first really great science about the climate was done in 1958 to 1962 or so. It was the first time CO2 could be accurately measured to the point of being able to determine not just that there was a gradient, but that the gradient was exponential. That was done by Charles Keeling, and that was announced by NSF in 1963, which, if, to my count, was 61 years ago. Every piece of science done since then has only confirmed this in higher detail. Think about that. And nobody has done anything to deal with the real problem. Why isn't there a headline on every paper published every day saying the world as we know it is definitely coming to an end and we can prove it? Think about that. So I think about what the computer can do about representing the kind of realities that we must be wary of and the kind of realities we'd like to make better is unique. And the fact that it can imitate paper is a bit of a parlor trick, and it's an important one because a lot of important knowledge is still in that form. We don't want to throw away the past because the future has something new to it. That is always the case. So our next speaker, Jim Hendler, I think will have something to say about meaning and the difference between meaning and data, I hope. I'm sure that he will. I'm relying on you, Jim, so I can throw this card away. So I was asked in the question, what are the opportunities for innovation? And I think a really important thing to think about is that the computer can actually transform what that even means. It's not just that we can innovate in lines that are understood by the general public for simple consumer electronics, but that we can actually innovate along the lines of the things that we desperately need to understand. So Einstein once pointed out that we cannot use the methods of thinking to solve the problems that we created with those methods of thinking. We need new methods of thinking, and this is a very good place to talk about that. Thank you. So,
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Alan, what do we need to learn in order to be more wise about how we use these incredible powers that we have been gifted with?
Well, I tried 5 different approaches here, and this proves that I don't have the wisdom to answer this question in a reasonable way. The old days, you followed around somebody like Socrates, but if you think of the other kinds of people that people also followed around. Just following around somebody you think is wise is not a very good way to do it. We need to have some sort of larger scope. We need better imaginations. We need to rely on our own thinking and to boost the thinking up so we can rely on it. And the problem with imagination is our Stone Age brains are really great at it, except they're great at things like spirits, gods, witches, magic, conspiracies. There was the great cat conspiracy in the 17th century when millions of cats in France and Belgium were massacred because somebody got the idea that they were witches. Look it up, there's a whole book with that title. The problem is we have real problems imagining exponential progressions. We have problems with scaling. We have problems with the very small. We can't even imagine a virus, let alone a tiny little molecule with carbon and 2 oxygens. It's like they're not there. We can't imagine the speeding. We can't manage big changes from normal. All of our prognostications are extrapolations, eventual consequences of actions rather than local consequences of action. That's a good one to think about. What's eventually going to happen if I do this? So this is kind of like trying to get a cat to think ahead, because they will just experiment with things and hope to survive. That's what we're doing. So I think a book I would recommend, which I'm pretty sure everybody in this audience, let's have a show of hands. How many people in this audience have read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow book? Okay, well, that's a big surprise. I recommend it to you. One of the best things he did, especially as a Nobel Prize winner, and a person who probably should belong to this society if he doesn't, but what he did was to say, look, it's too complicated in here. I want to write this book in terms of 2 lies, which he called expository fictions. It's like Picasso said, art is a lie that tells the truth. So what Kahneman based the book on was, let's take all the things in our brain that are there for dealing with very fast things. And then let's take all the things in our brain that are there for just dealing with slow things. Let's not worry about where they came from, what the anatomy of it is. Let's not worry about any. Let's just take those 2 things and take a look at human behavior and how it ramifies. And by the way, we can look at the brain with functional MRIs and actually see it doing this and that. And so once you start doing that, you realize wisdom is not actually something that you want to apply goals to or technologies to. It's actually a bigger deal than that. And putting technologies into the equation sets up a kind of debating society where you really don't want anybody to win. The idea of not winning in a debate, but actually using it to understand something is relatively wise. It's a way of looking at things. And when I think about where we are with public media, the thing I come back to is not so much the First Amendment of the Constitution or similar laws. I come back to, at what point do we decide yelling fire in a crowded theater is something not to be done? And at what point can we recognize certain uses of media on the current day internet and personal computing as the moral equivalent of fire? And what are we going to do about that? It's not a question, actually, of whether we're going to insult somebody or not. It's a question of public safety. So how about a new equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath for education? This would be a grand challenge for our society. Vinta and I have participated in several grand challenges in the past, none of which have ever been taken up, I might add. But the grand challenge would be, how can we understand human beings well enough to help us rather than hurt us? Because we're actually doing most of the things we do based on myths about ourselves that we've made up and we like to believe. I think it's way beyond the time when we should keep on doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good. So we'll now move to our third speaker, Jim Handler, and Mei Lin may introduce him and the topic.
Yes, Jim Handler is the father of the semantic web. He and Alan Kay have collaborated, and they in fact collaborated on these talks, so that Jim is really carrying on from where Alan left off. And I glad that Jim is here to speak about this, and he will also be speaking at the UN Science Summit on September 18th. We can start the video. Science is really a kind of a common definition shared by people who want to do science. But now, these definitions are not at all clear. So I'm really glad to have Jim Handler, one of the fathers of the semantic web, somebody who's probably thought about data more than 99% of all of you, and to ask him, as a leading AI researcher, one of the creators of the semantic web, from this perspective, has the internet opened new avenues for opportunity?
Yeah, so let me put some of this in perspective by saying that a lot of the time I feel like I have a split personality because my personal research is all about open data. How do we get more data sharing? How do we get... We can't do all those science plus X things, internet plus X things that Vince said, unless we can share scientific data. And more of that is getting interdisciplinary. So in fact, ways to allow communication where this scientist has this database and this scientist has that database and someone else has something else, and you want to bring those together is crucial. I've also worked in open government data. My colleague Nigel Shadbolt, who will be on the next panel, I hope will get a chance to talk about that a little more. But we set up a little competition secretly, and each got our bosses, him working with England and me working with the US, to compete with each other over who could release more data more quickly. Worked great for a while. And so this open data, open government data allowed a lot of innovation, allowed a lot of great things, okay? So what's my split personality? Well, the split part of it is, well, as of a couple weeks ago, I am the past chair of the ASAM's Global Technology Policy Council. And one of the things we instigated was the creation of what we call technology briefs, very short, 3 to 4 page, readable documents about key problems in society and some of the, not so much our solution recommendations, because we're trying not to be political, but really what regulators and et cetera should think about. I wish I had it with me today, but it has, the deadline for approval is tomorrow morning UK time, and hopefully it'll be on the internet Thursday. But our latest one is on data privacy, right? I'd just like to share a couple of numbers that we've looked at in that committee. 4.8 billion individuals worldwide have personal information that is for commercial sale. The projected 2031 total revenues of sort of the worldwide global market in data comes to somewhere along the line of $462 billion. And the one that really got me when we were looking some of this up, there it is. So in a study that was done, okay, 1.5 million people's information of 4 locations. So all that the researchers had was 4 things that said this person was at this place at this time. They were able to uniquely name 95% of them, right? So we think about data privacy, things like that, but they did. Now, here's the really scary thing about that. That study was done in 2013, right? Now there is so much more data you can integrate, that so much more we can do. So the opportunities for using this data to revolutionize science, to create new means of governance, to do, really allow communities. I use the example sometimes of how wonderful it would be if some group in Bangladesh could discover that they have a local problem that's already been solved by some group in, I don't know, Baltimore, Maryland, and somehow map across the communities, solving the language issues, which, by the way, are getting better, but really understanding how to map across these things with the help of computation. So I think the internet gives us that opportunity for that openness and flow and problem solution, but at the same time, it poses the challenge of how we're going to control that kind of information.
Wonderful. This issue of data, our AI is being trained on data. So much of the data that has been produced has happened in wealthy countries, in wealthy neighborhoods, for a lot of men. And so the implications and the algorithms are deriving from a view of the world that is not complete, not reflective of our humanity. So, Jim, in terms of the interoperability of data and data sharing in AI, what governance structures would be necessary to ensure that the benefits we can get are aligned with the interests of people who want to live, work, and play, and lead lives not maneuvered by data, and to serve everyone, not just a few?
So let me take up Alan's challenge and bring meaning into the conversation. I actually was once talking about some of this open data, closed data issues with Tim Berners-Lee, who said, it's not really just the data we have to understand, it's what that data is about. Gave a beautiful, simple example. If I have a database which has a field called name, a field called date, and a field called location, right? Well, it's pretty clear that that name had something to do with that date at that location. If I know that this is a mortality database for London, or if I know that it's a maternity database for London, then those dates mean something drastically different. One is likely to be the date of death, the other is likely to be the date of birth. That's a big difference, right? And you can't understand it from looking at the data. You have to understand it by, quote, understanding the data, by the metadata, by the meaning of the data. And that gets harder and harder as we get more and more separation of data types. Right, one of the reasons that the data brokers can do so well at collecting and sharing data is they're all trying to do the same thing, which is sell advertising based on personal data. What's harder is when you get 3 scientists, one who's over here in chemistry, one who's over here in prebiotic chemistry or early Earth chemistry, and one here who's studying Mars. And I picked that not at a random because I'm trying to work on a project where we're doing exactly that. We're trying to see, Mars is essentially a frozen version of the early Earth. And because of a lot of investment by NASA in the past few years, people have been studying Mars, right? And is it habitable and things like that, looking for life on Mars, et cetera. We're looking at trying to invert that. Can we take what we're learning about Mars and use it to help us understand how life on Earth emerged? Right? Big scientific question, great opportunity, also talks to how you work on threats and things like that. And what we've discovered is putting the data together is really difficult. Not just the access, but what did different people mean by the different fields? And even though we have these long, complex data dictionaries that explain everything in natural language, and we can use LLMs and all this great AI technology, still doesn't help much. Because the most common terms become the one that are the hardest to share. And if I had more time, I would talk about that at great length. I've written many papers on it and stuff. So, once you're into a technical field and you're using a term in a very technical way, it's easy. But when you're up at a much higher level and use terms, and particularly between qualitative social science, quantitative data science, the terms don't overlap. A colleague of mine who was looking at children's health had a wonderful example, right? One of the issues that all of these different people were interested in was the mother's educational level. But even knowing that, the problem was how do they put together data where one database has yes or no, one database has pre-college or post-college, and one has how many years in each form. There is no wonderful mapping there, but using the kind of knowledge, using the kind of tools, using the kind of things the internet allows, we can ask that question, we can approach those people, we can do some of these things. That's science. Now, again, take that same thing for community problem solving, take that for the people-oriented stuff. So what I think is we need regulation that controls who controls the data and how, right? Tim spends a lot of his time looking at the control of personal data. So those 4.8 billion people should have some say over which of their data they're willing to share with who for what, okay? At the same time, we're looking for regulation that says maybe some of our old laws on data control don't make any sense. So, in both the UK and the US, we have these incredibly strict rules about releasing health data, which is wonderful, don't get me wrong. I love that we have those rules. If you're wearing a Fitbit, right, they have all that data. As you get more and more instrumentation on your Apple Watch, on your health app, none of that is protected that way. If you go to ChatGPT and say, hey, here's my family history, tell me, why I might have these symptoms, they can share that information with anyone they want. So I think the opportunity is bringing this stuff together, and I think the regulatory challenge is really very much who controls it and for what purpose.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, that is the end of the video presentations. Now we do have a few minutes for questions, and I prefer that you type them in text chat, and then we'll read them if need be, and Mei Lin will answer them in voice. So go ahead, please. So Dan Miami asks, what is the use of internet for helping people with disabilities? But how will the internet influence education? Mei Lin, what do you have to say about that?
I think this is actually the very most important question. The conversation I just had with Alan Kay was the question of science and children, science and digital literacy. We're at the beginning of a really long journey on this. And your questions, whether, I want to say, your questions, you should consider it not for me, but questions that I can bring to both Alan Kay and Jim Hendler so that they can answer it in their next talk. Because we only have not that much time to tap the wisdom of the fathers of the internet, what they had in mind, but we also have to take into account how can their wisdom guide our future action. Thank you, George.
All right, anybody else? Okay, the question from Roy, do you see metaverse as the future of the internet?
Some version of the metaverse. I'm interested in the whole area of digital twins, but I'm really influenced by the thinking of Douglas Engelbart, where he wrote a paper, which I highly recommend, called Augmenting Human Intellect. And the idea that there's a metaverse in which we as humans are augmented to interact with each other in ways that allow us to realize our potential, our hopes and dreams, not just for ourselves, but for us in our families, in our communities, as collective humanity living now, and to augment us for leaving a better world for future generations. This is the metaverse that I would like to see, a metaverse for augmenting humanity.
Well, that can clearly be enough for discussion of its own, and maybe we should organize one. And let's do that in the future. But any other questions for Mei Lin while we're here?
I can answer Roy's question, which is in the chat. Instead of a second website, you go to a third three-dimensional metaspaces. What the most obvious application of this is for us to find our tribe. That each person is unique, but there are people who are extremely compatible mentally that exist in the world. And so the metaverse of allowing people to both find their tribes, but also making sure that the tribes don't go into isolation, but interact and are able to cross-fertilize. That to me is a very important characteristic of the future metaverse. In New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, there's something like 99 languages. And it's a small country, but there are 99 languages because the tribes were so separated by very high mountains, they never got to see each other and they had their own language. We do have the danger of actually separating out into these sort of mentally compatible tribes and developing our own languages and our own science. And so for Douglas Engelbart, the idea of collective intelligence and being able to bridge between networks of communities was his overriding priority. And he actually didn't go to Xerox PARC, even though his entire team went, because he was very, very worried about the separation that would happen if we just took the technology and augmented single human beings. He considered the largest problem is how do we augment our collective intelligence? And as you can see with AI now, people are talking about, okay, we don't need humans. This is the absolute opposite of what the people who made the breakthroughs of the internet wanted to leave for future generations. So we at the People-Centered Internet say, without you, we are lost. Because if we just let the for-profit and the for-power people take these powerful tools, they will take us where we don't want to go. That's what we stand for, and that's why we're working at the level of the UN and trying to make sure that these discussions actually take place and to inspire your generation and the ones following us that, in fact, more exciting opportunities for invention are opening up. But we need to go into that digital frontier with hope and as a collective group.
Thank you. This is a good way to end the first part of our celebration. So let me just remind you all that we will continue tomorrow with a lot more time for questions, starting at 11 a.m. SLT. And after we dissipate here, please join us for a regular Saturday piano concert over in the Music Pavilion. If you don't know where it is, just follow Shiloh. She'll take you there. And now let's thank Mei Lin again.